Clara stepped over the threshold, the door creaking as it shut behind her. The house felt like a place forgotten, its walls thick with the weight of too many years and too little care. Dust clung to the corners, untouched and unmoved. It smelled of must, wood, and something else. Something older, like a memory too heavy to shake off. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric worn thin from years of use. This was it. The job. She'd seen the ad in the local paper. Cook for 1 week, good pay, and had answered it without much thought. Desperation did that. The kind of desperation that made you take what you could get, no matter how strange the offer. It wasn't the kind of work she was used to, but the money was enough to keep her afloat for a little while, maybe even long enough to get away from the weight of her past. "Mr. Cordero," she called, her voice quiet, tentative. It echoed in the silence, unanswered for a beat. She stepped further into the house, her boots clicking softly against the wooden floors. There was no sound of movement, no sign of life. She shifted her weight, glancing around, a flicker of unease pulling at her gut. A door creaked open and she froze. A man stepped into the hallway, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that seemed to catch everything, even in the dim light. Mr. Cordero. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, sizing her up, as if trying to decide if she was the one he'd been waiting for. "You're Clara?" His voice was deep, low, steady but distant, like he'd been waiting for her a long time. "Yes, sir," she replied, a bit too quickly. She swallowed. "I saw your ad. I can start right away." He nodded, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Follow me." She did as he asked, following him down a narrow hallway into a kitchen that felt colder than the rest of the house. The sink was piled with dishes, half-finished meals still lingering, the remnants of lives that hadn't quite moved on. A lone window above the sink let in just enough light to cast long, shadowed lines across the worn countertop. "You'll cook, clean, and take care of things for a week," Mr. Cordero said, his back to her as he opened a cabinet, pulling out a few jars. "The pay's good, as I said." Clara set her bag down on the floor, watching him. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, like someone who didn't quite want to be noticed, but there was something in his eyes, a guardedness, an edge. It made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She had seen that look before. It was the kind of look that people wore when they were hiding something. "Is it just you?" Clara asked, her voice quieter now, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He turned, eyes narrowing for just a second. "Just me." His voice was firm, final. She didn't ask anything else. It wasn't her place to pry. The house felt like it had enough secrets as it was. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something she didn't understand. The weight of it pressed on her chest, but she pushed it aside. She was here for the money, nothing more, nothing less. "Can you make stew?" Mr. Cordero's voice broke through her thoughts. "There's meat in the fridge. You'll find everything you need." Clara nodded, trying to force a smile. "I can make stew." She moved to the fridge, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The ingredients inside were sparse, but enough for the meal he'd requested. She pulled them out one by one, setting them on the counter as she worked. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. He didn't speak again, and she didn't push for conversation. This wasn't about making small talk. This was about survival. As she chopped vegetables and stirred the pot, Clara's thoughts drifted back to her past, to the years of loss and loneliness that had brought her here. But she shoved them away, burying them under the simple tasks at hand. The past had no place here. Not now. She focused on the rhythm of her knife against the cutting board, the steady simmer of the stew on the stove. Mr. Cordero stood by the door, watching her, but not speaking. His silence was almost oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her, making her feel as though she were being measured, tested. She didn't mind the silence. In fact, it was better this way. Less to explain. No need for small talk, no need for stories. Just the work, just the job. When the stew was done, she ladled it into a bowl, setting it in front of him. He took it without a word, his eyes briefly meeting hers. He said nothing about the meal, but his expression softened just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small acknowledgement, maybe. Clara stood across the room watching him. Something about the way he held himself made her uneasy, but she couldn't put her finger on why. She looked down at the plate of food, feeling the tension of the moment settle into the corners of the room. "I'll stay the week," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, even if her insides weren't. "But that's all, a week, and then I'll be gone." Mr. Cordero didn't look up from his meal. "We'll see." Clara nodded, her stomach tight. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she didn't ask. The week ahead loomed large in her mind, as empty and uncertain as the house around her. And with that uncertainty came a quiet sense of resolve. She wasn't here to stay, but she would see it through. Whatever came next, she could handle it. Clara set the table in the dim kitchen, the sound of her movements muffled by the thick walls of the house. The old wood beneath her hands creaked under the weight of her thoughts. Mr. Cordero hadn't spoken much since she arrived, but he was there now, sitting at the worn table, his dark eyes following her every move. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, resting on the surface like a man, preparing for something he couldn't control. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the chill between them. Clara focused on the task at hand, putting the last of the bread down, her fingers brushing against the rough surface of the wooden table. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The air felt thick, like something was waiting, something unsaid too heavy to bear. "You like your food simple, I take it?" Clara asked, her voice quieter than usual. Her tone wasn't one of curiosity, more a need to fill the space between them. Mr. Cordero didn't answer right away. He just nodded, his eyes lingering on the edge of the table. The silence between them felt loud, pressing in on her. She waited for him to speak, but when he didn't, she took the seat across from him and started serving. The sound of her spoon scraping the sides of the pot echoed in the small room. Clara wasn't sure how long they'd been sitting there in this half-silence, but it felt like hours. She placed the bowl of stew in front of him, her hand shaking just slightly. He didn't say thank you, didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed, like he was waiting for something, or maybe trying to avoid something. She couldn't decide which. "You've got a quiet house," she said after a long pause, her voice almost breaking the tension. "Not many people here, huh?" Mr. Cordero's lips twitched, but there was no smile. "Not many people come around," he said, his words clipped, guarded. "Not the way things are." Clara looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. There was something in his voice. Something buried beneath the surface. He was telling her more than he meant to, but just enough to keep her in place. She glanced down at the table, her eyes catching the edge of a folded letter, half hidden under his plate. It was old, the paper yellowed, the handwriting scrawled, uneven. Something about it felt wrong. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something familiar in the shape of the letter, though she couldn't say what. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the surface of the table, and Mr. Cordero's eyes flicked to her hand. The tension snapped. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. But he didn't stop her. He didn't say anything. He just watched her, like he was waiting for her to make a choice. Clara took the letter, slowly pulling it from beneath his plate. She didn't look at it yet. She just held it, feeling its weight in her palm. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she held herself together. She had to. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just a meal. It was bigger than him. She knew it now. Mr. Cordero didn't say a word, his expression unreadable. The meal, the quiet, the house, it all seemed to pulse with something darker, something she wasn't sure she could name. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't try to stop her. He just waited. Clara's mind raced. She could leave. She could walk out and never come back. She could take her things, head back into the world where things weren't so heavy, so suffocating, but something told her to stay. She wasn't sure why, but the weight of the house, the silence, the letter, it all pulled at her. She needed to know. She needed to understand. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the worn words. They were simple, nothing too grand, but the words felt familiar. A name she didn't recognize, a promise broken long ago. The letter was a message of sorts, but Clara couldn't make sense of it yet. Not fully, but she could feel the pull. It was like a thread unraveling, pulling her into something much bigger than she expected. "You don't say much," she finally said, her voice thick with the weight of what she had just discovered. "Anything you'd like to share?" Mr. Cordero looked at her, and for a moment his eyes softened, but only for a moment. "Not everything needs to be said," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not everything is yours to know." Clara's heart skipped. She wasn't sure if he was threatening her or warning her. Maybe both. But she didn't care. She put the letter down, folded it carefully, and slid it back under his plate. She didn't know what it meant, not yet. But it didn't matter, not tonight. "Guess I'll just make the best of it," Clara said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. She picked up her spoon again, stirring the stew, the weight of the silence growing heavier by the second. Mr. Cordero didn't respond. He only nodded slightly, his attention once again turning inward, his mind somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't. Clara's mind, however, was racing. She knew now she wasn't just here to cook. She was here to uncover the truth, to piece together the puzzle that this man, this house, and this town had been hiding for far too long. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what she might find, but she knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until she had everything. The meal passed in quiet tension. The only sound was the crackling fire and the occasional scrape of metal against wood. Neither of them said anything more, but the space between them had shifted, and Clara felt it, the pull to stay. Clara hadn't noticed at first, but the absence of family in the house began to weigh on her. It was a quiet thing at first, something just out of sight, like a shadow in the corner of her vision. There were no pictures of children on the walls, no family portraits, no toys tucked away in corners, no laughter echoing down the halls, nothing that said this was a home filled with life, just silence. The longer Clara stayed, the more the emptiness seemed to seep into the walls, into the floorboards. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was missing. She hadn't asked about it yet. It felt too invasive, too forward, but the questions were starting to build up inside her, slow and steady like a pressure that wouldn't let go. One afternoon, while Mr. Cordero was out, Clara wandered through the house, her footsteps soft against the worn floors. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rooms. In the living room, she found it, the photograph album. It was tucked behind a stack of old books on a shelf like it had been forgotten. She picked it up carefully, wiping the dust off the cover, and opened it. The first pages were filled with faces she didn't recognize. Black and white photos, faded and worn. The kind of pictures you didn't want to touch too much for fear they'd crumble. But Clara flipped through them slowly, unable to stop. There were men, women, older people, a few families sitting together on porches or standing in front of barns, all smiling in the way people did when they had nothing but the land and each other. But there was something about the faces that made her uneasy. There was a distance to them, something cold behind the smiles, a sadness in their eyes. And then she saw it. A picture of children, 3 of them, standing in a row on the steps of the house. 2 girls and a boy, all young, all laughing, their faces full of life. Clara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. They were smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached their eyes. No, this was the kind of smile that spoke of a family trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. Something Clara knew all too well. She flipped the page. Another picture, and another. The same children, but this time there was a woman with them. A woman whose face Clara couldn't quite make out, but there was something about the way she stood that felt familiar. The way her arms were wrapped around the children, holding them close, like they were the only things keeping her together. Clara's heart thudded against her chest. She turned the pages faster now, as if trying to piece something together, but the photographs stopped. There were no more pictures of the children, no more of the woman. Just the fading, faceless images of a life that had moved on, or maybe had been forced out. She closed the album with a snap, a heavy breath escaping her lips. The house felt quieter now, more hollow. She could almost hear the echoes of the children's laughter in the corners of the rooms, faint but persistent. She could feel the absence of them, of whoever had been here before her. Something was wrong. Something was missing. That night, Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was still, but she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing those faces. The children. The woman. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. The darkness grew thicker around her as she closed her eyes. And then she heard it. The laugh. A soft, high-pitched sound that drifted through the air like a memory, familiar but distant. It wasn't a child's laugh. It was the laugh of a woman, warm and full of life, yet tinged with something that felt too sad to bear. It echoed in the room, soft at first, then louder until it felt like it was right beside her. She reached out for the light, But it was no use. The laugh only grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking. But the laugh didn't stop. It didn't answer. It only lingered in the air until it was all Clara could hear. When she woke the next morning, the house was silent again, the dream fading like smoke. But the weight of it stayed with her, heavy on her chest. She couldn't shake the image of the woman, the one she hadn't seen in the photographs, the one who laughed, but whose laughter was already a ghost. She hadn't asked Mr. Cordero about the family. She hadn't asked about the children, and she didn't know if she ever would. But the pull of the past was becoming stronger with each passing day. The past that haunted these walls, that lingered in the corners, in the shadows. And Clara knew deep down that she was a part of it now. Whatever had happened here before her arrival was no longer just someone else's story. It was hers, too. The wind had kicked up by the time Clara heard the knock at the door. It was sharp, insistent, like someone who didn't want to be ignored. She set down the broom she'd been holding and walked toward the door, her boots scraping against the worn floorboards. It wasn't the kind of knock that said visitor or friend. It was the kind that made you feel like you were about to learn something you weren't ready for. When she opened the door, the woman was standing there, framed by the overcast sky, her silhouette sharp and ragged like the edges of the land outside. She was older, her face weathered by years of sun and wind. Her hands, though, were the first thing Clara noticed. They were rough, calloused, cracked, the skin stained by work that wouldn't ever wash out. A farm woman's hands. Tough hands. The woman didn't say anything at first, just looked at Clara, her eyes dark and unreadable. She stood still, like she didn't expect to be invited in, but wasn't leaving either. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady, like it had been used to carrying through a lot of silence. "I used to work here," she said, her words hanging in the air. "Long time ago." Clara blinked, unsure what to make of it. "I didn't know anyone worked here before me," she said, glancing over her shoulder into the dim house. "Mr. Cordero didn't mention it." The woman gave a short, dry laugh. "He wouldn't." Her voice was harsh, rough, like it didn't belong to a woman at all, but to the land itself. "I worked for him when he was younger, when the house was different." Clara stepped back, pulling the door wider. Something in the way the woman spoke unsettled her, but she wasn't going to turn her away. Not yet. "Come in," Clara said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I can make tea if you want." The woman nodded and stepped inside, her boots scraping against the floor as she passed Clara. She didn't look around at the house and didn't seem interested in its stillness. She just moved like she belonged, like she had always belonged here. Clara led her to the kitchen, where the woman sat at the table without asking. Clara set the kettle on the stove, the sharp clang of it against the iron stove too loud in the silence. She kept her eyes on the woman's hands as she worked. There was something about them, something that felt too old, too worn for someone who still walked around on their own. "I used to cook here," the woman said, breaking the silence, as if reading Clara's mind. "Cooked for Mr. Cordero's family." She paused, looking at Clara, her eyes flicking to the door. "They don't come around anymore." Clara nodded, not sure what to say. She could feel the weight of the words, though. The house felt smaller, heavier, with every passing second. "I've seen you," the woman said, leaning forward, her voice lowering. "You don't belong here, not like they did." Clara didn't know how to respond to that. She felt the pull of something, a truth she couldn't reach, and yet it was sitting right in front of her. The kettle whistled, and Clara took it off the stove, her hands steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. She poured the water into 2 chipped cups and handed one to the woman. Her fingers brushed against the woman's rough hand, and she flinched, surprised at how cold the skin was. Like a ghost. The woman's grip was firm, though, and Clara felt something in it. A warning, maybe, or a challenge. "You should be careful," the woman said suddenly, her voice almost too quiet. "Things here aren't what they seem. That house has a way of changing you. People come and they go, but the house stays the same." She took a sip of her tea, her lips tight. "If you're not careful, you'll end up like the rest of them." Clara looked up, her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. The woman set the cup down, her hands slow and deliberate, like every movement mattered. "Mr. Cordero's family," she began, her eyes darkening. "They didn't leave by choice. They didn't die by chance. They were taken. The house. It took them." Clara's pulse quickened. She felt the words hang in the air, choking the light out of the room. She looked at the woman's hands again, the way they seemed to shake ever so slightly now. It was as if they had been holding on to something too heavy, too painful, for too long. Taken, Clara echoed, trying to make sense of it. By what? The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor in a slow, deliberate motion. Clara stood too, unsure of what to do. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the blood in her ears. The woman moved to the door, her back turned to Clara as she paused in the doorway. "You'll find out," she said, her voice distant like she was speaking from a place far away. "But you might not want to." Clara didn't speak as the woman stepped out into the darkening evening. The door clicked shut behind her, and Clara was left in the thick, heavy silence once again. But the weight of her words hung in the air, lingering like smoke. She stood there for a long time, the cup of tea still in her hand, its warmth fading. She didn't know what to think, but she knew one thing. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just a job. Something was wrong with this house. Something had always been wrong, and Clara was just beginning to see the edges of it. Clara stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables with a steady hand, but her mind was far away. It had been nearly a week since she arrived, and the silence of the house was beginning to weigh on her. The routine had settled in. Cook, clean, serve. It was all simple enough, but beneath the quiet there was a tension she couldn't escape, something in the air that felt too thick to breathe. She had thought about leaving. Every night the thought tugged at her, a thread she could pull. The money had been good, but it wasn't worth the heaviness in her chest. It wasn't worth the creeping sense that something was wrong, that she was being pulled into something she didn't understand. Maybe it was time to pack up and go. There was always another job, always another town. She could leave before it got any worse. But then Mr. Cordero had said it. Sunday meal, don't leave yet. The way he said it made her hesitate, and so she stayed. For one more meal, one more day. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, staring out of the window. The sky had darkened, and the wind outside had picked up. The house felt quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. She glanced over at the table, her fingers curling into the cloth as she thought about what was to come. A soft knock on the door startled her. She hadn't been expecting anyone, least of all him. Clara didn't answer right away. She didn't want to. But then the door creaked open, and Mr. Cordero stepped inside, a strange look on his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his coat dusty from the wind outside. "Dinner's almost ready," Clara said, her voice sounding too sharp in the quiet. He nodded, taking a seat at the table without a word. Clara went back to the stove, stirring the pot absently. She could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to look at him. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the tension thick between them. He was waiting for something, and so was she. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "Are you going to ask me?" Mr. Cordero's voice broke the silence. His tone was softer than she expected, but it carried a weight, a gravity. Clara didn't look up. "Ask you what?" "The reason," he said. "Why are you still here?" She froze. Her knife clinked softly against the cutting board. It was the question she had been avoiding, the question she couldn't answer. "Don't know," Clara murmured. "Guess I haven't figured it out yet." She continued cutting, her hands moving faster now. A little too fast, like she was trying to outrun the conversation. The room grew colder, the fire in the hearth crackling, too loud in the silence. "I thought I was just here to cook," she added, her voice tight. "For a week." Mr. Cordero was quiet for a long time, and for a second Clara thought he might have fallen asleep at the table. But then he spoke, his voice low. "People don't stay just for the job," he said almost to himself. "Not here, not for long." Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't ask him what he meant. She didn't want to know. The last thing she needed was another layer of mystery to unravel. She was already in over her head. She finished the meal in silence, setting the plates down in front of him. His gaze flicked to the food, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Only distance, a distance she couldn't reach. Clara sat across from him, her fingers tightening around her fork. The food was good, but it tasted dull in her mouth. The house, the meal, the conversation, it all felt too heavy, too thick with things that hadn't been said. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging on like a weight pressing down on her chest. Then, just as she picked up her fork, she heard it, Laughter, soft at first, then louder, ringing through the house like a memory she couldn't shake. The children. Her hand froze mid-air, the fork dangling. The sound of their laughter echoed in her mind, distant but real. It wasn't just the wind, not this time. She could almost see them, their faces, their little bodies running through the hallways, playing in the dust. But when she tried to focus, the image blurred, fading like mist. Mr. Cordero's eyes flicked to her, narrowing slightly. "What's wrong?" Clara shook her head, her throat tight. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was something. Something she didn't understand, something she couldn't explain. She wasn't sure if she was hearing things or if the house itself was playing tricks on her. The laugh faded, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "I'll finish the meal," Clara said, her voice rough, quieter than usual. "You've been kind enough to offer me a place. It's the least I can do." Mr. Cordero didn't respond at first, but then he nodded, his gaze steady, as if weighing something in his mind. "I don't need your charity," he said, his voice blunt, too sharp. "Just do your job." Clara flinched at the coldness of his words. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to say anymore. The meal stretched on in silence, the minutes dragging by like hours. She could feel the weight of his presence at the table, but it wasn't a comfort. It wasn't even a company. It was just another thing she had to endure. And yet, as she sat there, Clara realized something. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place, more to this man, than she had figured out so far. Something deeper, something darker. She wasn't here just for the job anymore. She wasn't sure if that was a choice, or if it was something the house had decided for her. But for the first time since she arrived, she wasn't so sure she wanted to leave. Not yet. Not until she understood. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as Clara worked in the kitchen. The house had been quiet all day, save for the occasional creaks of the old wood. She moved through the motions of preparing the evening meal, chopping vegetables, stirring the stew, her thoughts distant, lost in the thick silence. Mr. Cordero had been uncharacteristically absent. He had slipped into one of his moods again, leaving her to the solitude of the house, as if they were both carrying some unspoken weight neither of them wanted to address. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, her mind wandering. There had been something strange in Mr. Cordero's eyes earlier, something that unsettled her. And the laughter, she still couldn't shake the sound of it, the way it echoed in her head. It felt like the house itself was speaking to her, pulling her in deeper. She could almost hear the children's voices, soft and distant, like whispers carried on the wind. But when she tried to focus on the sound, it always faded, like a dream slipping away at the edge of consciousness. Then there was a knock at the door. Clara jumped, startled by the suddenness of it. She wiped her hands quickly on her apron again and walked toward the door. The house had been so quiet, and yet now it seemed alive with anticipation, a weight in the air, a tension she hadn't noticed before. She reached for the doorknob, her heart beating faster than it should have been. When she opened the door, she froze. 5 children stood on the porch, their faces pale and drawn, eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't anything like joy either. They were dirty, clothes torn, hair matted with dirt. Their faces were streaked with grime, their bare feet caked in mud. They looked like they had walked miles in the cold, their bodies trembling not just from the chill, but from something deeper, something older, like they had been carrying a burden far beyond their years. Clara's mouth went dry. Who are you?" she asked, her voice tight. The children didn't answer. Instead, the oldest boy, perhaps 10 or 11, stepped forward. His eyes were too old for his face, his gaze empty, like he had seen too much. He looked at her, and then, without hesitation, said, "Mother." Clara blinked. The word hit her like a punch to the gut. "What?" "Number I'm not." But the boy wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his small hand outstretched toward her. The others followed him, the silence hanging heavy between them. They looked at her like they knew her, like they were waiting for something from her. They all called her the same thing, Mother. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, then louder, with more insistence. Mother. The word echoed in her mind, a weight she couldn't ignore. She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The children didn't seem to mind. They just stood there, silent and still, their eyes fixed on her with an unsettling calmness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Clara swallowed hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She glanced behind her at the empty house, the quiet, hollow rooms that had seemed so familiar just moments ago. She wasn't alone anymore, not with them here. What's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward again, and this time, Clara didn't move. She was too stunned, too unsettled by the suddenness of it all. The other children were still, watching her with eyes that seemed too knowing, too old. One of them, a girl about 6, clutched a doll to her chest, the doll's face as faded and worn as their own. The house was changing again. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the past was bleeding into the present, filling the empty spaces with memories Clara didn't recognize. It was as if the house itself was trying to bring the past back to life, to make it whole again. And now, Clara was caught in the middle of it. She didn't know what to do, didn't know what any of this meant. The boy finally spoke again, his voice soft but urgent. "We need you. You have to take care of us." Clara shook her head. I don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer her question. Instead, he looked behind her, his gaze flicking toward the empty rooms of the house. "They're waiting for us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They always wait." A chill ran down Clara's spine. She took a step back, her hands shaking at her sides. "Who's waiting?" But before the boy could answer, the little girl spoke, her voice small and scared. "The house," she whispered. "The house is waiting for you." The words settled into Clara's chest like stones. She didn't know what they meant, but she could feel the weight of them. She could feel the house's eyes on her, the way it watched her every move, waiting for her to do something, to decide something. But she wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for them. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as the children stood before her, their eyes never leaving her face. Clara felt her heart pounding in her ears, but she didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to say. Everything inside her screamed to run, to leave, to pack up, and never look back. But she couldn't. Not now. Something was pulling her in, something beyond her control. Something inside the house was calling her, and she knew, deep down, that she couldn't escape it. She glanced at the children again. They were waiting, watching her. She was their mother, whether she understood why or not. And in that moment, Clara realized something. The house wasn't just waiting for her to stay. It was waiting for her to remember who she really was. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Come inside," she said. Her voice cracked as she spoke the words, but they were the only words that felt right, the only words that made sense. The children didn't speak again. They just followed her inside, silent as shadows, their presence filling the house in ways Clara couldn't explain. As they entered, the door creaked shut behind them, and Clara's hidden strength, her resolve, her unwillingness to be broken, began to awaken. The house was quiet, as it always was, but tonight, it felt different. Clara could feel it in her bones, the air thick with something old and lingering. She stood in the kitchen, the sound of the wind outside carrying through the walls, the shadows stretching longer in the dim light. She had just finished feeding the children, their silent eyes watching her as they ate. When it started, at first it was a flicker, just a small spark in the hearth. But then it grew. The fire spread quickly, consuming the room with an intensity that Clara hadn't expected. It wasn't just the wood that caught fire, it was everything. The air, the memories, the silence that had hung over the house for so long. It was like something had been waiting for this moment, for the fire to come alive again. Clara watched, her heart beating steadily in her chest, but there was no fear in her, no panic. She didn't flinch. Instead, Clara moved toward the flames, her steps slow but deliberate. The fire didn't touch her. It didn't burn her. It was as if the flames recognized her, as if they had been waiting for her to take control. Her hands moved through the heat, her fingers brushing against the air as she focused, her mind clear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random fire. This was something that had been set into motion long ago. She didn't waste time thinking about how the fire had started. Instead, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the blaze behind her. The house was full of secrets, secrets that were burning, slowly. But they wouldn't be consumed just by fire. Not yet. Clara stepped outside, the cold air biting against her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her mind was already far away, her thoughts focused on the one thing she hadn't yet understood. Why had Mr. Cordero hired her? Why had she been brought here, to this house full of memories and shadows? It wasn't just for cooking. She could feel that. It wasn't just for a job. She needed answers. And there was one person in town who might have them. The sheriff's office was small, tucked in the corner of a dusty street. The town wasn't much more than a cluster of houses and a few old businesses that had seen better days. But Clara knew the sheriff. She had seen him around before, always watching, always quiet, always a little too careful with his words. She walked through the door, the bell above it jingling. The sheriff looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. She wasn't here to ask for help, not exactly. She wasn't here to be polite. "What can I do for you, Clara?" the sheriff asked, his voice low, cautious. "I need to know about Mr. Cordero," Clara said, her voice steady. "About his history. What's he really hiding?" The sheriff's face tightened, but he didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You know I can't help you with that," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't want to dig into that history. You don't want to know what's buried out there." Clara felt her patience wearing thin, but she didn't let it show. "I'm already here," she said, "and I'm already digging." The sheriff's gaze flickered toward the door, toward the town outside, but he didn't look back at her. "Mr. Cordero's family. They weren't good people. They've been gone for years, but the damage they left behind is still here. The land, the house, it's all part of it." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What happened?" The sheriff stood up, pacing behind his desk, his hands fidgeting with the buttons on his coat. He spoke, but his words were clipped, like he didn't want to say them, like they were things he had buried a long time ago. "Mr. Cordero wasn't always Mr. Cordero," he began, his voice tight. "His family came from money, power. They had a stake in this town, in everything. But they were ruthless, the kind of people who would do anything to protect what they had, no matter the cost." Clara listened closely, her body tense as she hung on every word. She could feel the weight of what he was saying, but there was more. She knew there had to be more. "Do you know what happened to them?" she asked, her voice low. The sheriff stopped, his back to her, staring out of the window into the quiet town. "They were taken," he said finally, his words coming out like a confession. "All of them, one by one. No one knows exactly how, but they disappeared. The house was left behind empty, but the fire—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The fire wasn't an accident. That fire was meant to take them." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. "What fire?" The sheriff turned to face her, his face grim. "The one that burned down their house. The one that burned everything. That fire wasn't just to destroy property. It was to burn something deeper, something that couldn't be allowed to live anymore." Clara's mind raced. She had heard the house was burning, but now it made sense. The fire was always part of the plan. It was a cycle, a warning, a cleansing. She stood still, her mind a blur of thoughts, trying to piece everything together. And Mr. Cordero, where is he in all of this? The sheriff hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "He's the last one left, the one who stayed behind trying to fix what his family broke. But he's not the one who can undo it. No one can. Not really." Clara's thoughts were racing. The house, the fire, the children, Mr. Cordero, everything was connected. She wasn't here just to cook. She was here to fix something, to right a wrong. She stood up, her resolve solidifying. "I'm not leaving, Sheriff. Not until I understand what's really happening here." The sheriff didn't try to stop her. He just shook his head, his face tired, as if he knew what was coming next. "Then you're deeper than you know." Clara turned and walked out of the sheriff's office, her mind set on the house, on the fire, on the broken legacy that she had been pulled into. She wasn't sure how, but she would find a way to fix it, to end it. The house was waiting for her, and she was ready to face it. Clara stood at the edge of the well, her feet shifting uneasily in the dry earth. It was quiet here, quieter than it should have been, the kind of silence that pressed against your skin like a weight. The well was old, its stones cracked and weathered by years of neglect. A thin veil of moss clung to the edges, and a faint odor of damp earth lingered in the air. The house, distant behind her, was still, the wind carrying only the faintest sound of creaking wood. She hadn't meant to come here, not really. But something had drawn her, some invisible thread that had yanked at her heart and pulled her toward the spot she had only glimpsed from afar. The well had always been there, a feature of the land, but she hadn't thought about it much. Not until now. Clara swallowed, trying to shake off the chill creeping up her spine. There was something unsettling about it, something ancient, something that whispered just beyond her comprehension. The earth beneath her feet felt heavy, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for her to understand what she couldn't yet see. As she stepped closer to the well, Clara's gaze dropped to the dark water below, barely visible in the shadow depths. The silence seemed to press in on her, thick and suffocating. And then, faintly, like a murmur from the earth itself, she heard it, a whisper, soft but clear, rising from the dark. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a feeling, an unspoken promise, the kind of promise that only the earth could make. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, the sound echoing in her ears. She leaned in closer, drawn to it, unable to look away. The whisper seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her own heartbeat, growing louder, more insistent. She could feel it in her bones, the weight of it, the heaviness pressing against her chest. She didn't know what it was, but it was something. Something that had been buried for too long, hidden beneath layers of earth and time. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she stepped back, gasping for air as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. She couldn't explain it, but she knew one thing for sure. The well had been calling her. Turning away from the well, Clara felt a sudden pull at her sleeve. She spun around, startled to find the children standing behind her. They hadn't made a sound, hadn't even moved until now. Their faces were still, their eyes empty, like they were waiting for something to happen, but they weren't quite sure what. The oldest boy stood in front of the others, his eyes wide and watching. His small hand reached out, his fingers twitching, as if mimicking some invisible movement. The girl with the doll was standing still, staring at Clara with a cold, unnerving gaze. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying Clara's every move. "They're coming," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. "They've always come." Clara blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "Who's coming?" she asked, her voice tight. But the boy didn't answer. Instead, his hands began to move, mimicking the motion of digging, his small fingers clawing at the air as if pulling something from the ground. The others followed suit, their bodies jerking in unison as if they were all part of some silent ritual. Clara watched in horror as they moved, their erratic movements growing more frantic, more unnatural. The girl with the doll spoke, her voice eerily calm. "The well takes what it needs," she said, her words flat, devoid of emotion. "It takes what is buried." Clara's chest tightened and she took a step back. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But instead, she stood frozen, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The children's behavior, it wasn't normal. Their movements, their words, were too much like something she had seen in the shadows of the house, something she couldn't place. The well, the earth, the way it seemed to beckon her. It was all connected, all of it. Suddenly, Clara felt the weight of the past pressing down on her like 1,000 hands, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into the earth. The house, the fire, the children, none of it was just coincidence. It was all part of something older, something buried beneath the surface of time. And now, she was part of it, whether she understood it or not. The children stopped moving, their hands falling limp at their sides. The air around them grew colder, the silence returning in full force. Clara could hear her heartbeat in her ears, louder than the world around her. Her eyes flicked back to the well, and for a moment, it felt as though the earth itself was watching her, waiting for her to take the next step. "Why do you want me here?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking, barely audible above the wind. The boy looked at her, his face expressionless. "You're here to help us," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you won't be the last." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant, didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words settled into her chest, pushing down, making it hard to breathe. She looked at the children, their faces still, their eyes empty. And then, with a sudden clarity, she understood. The children weren't just here to haunt her. They were here to lead her somewhere, to show her something she couldn't yet see. They were part of the house's past, part of something that had been buried long ago. And now she was part of it too. Her resolve hardened. She wasn't going to be silenced again. She wasn't going to let the house, or the children, or the whispers from the well take her without a fight. Clara turned and walked away from the well, the children following her in silence. The past was waiting, and this time she was ready to face it. The sheriff's office was quieter than usual when Clara stepped inside, the faint smell of old paper and ink clinging to the walls. There was no bustle, no sign of the usual law enforcement activity. Instead, the space felt abandoned, as though it were holding its breath. The room seemed to shrink the moment Clara crossed the threshold, the weight of her purpose hanging heavy in the air. The sheriff was seated behind his desk, but he didn't look up right away. His hands were on a stack of papers, the edges worn and yellowed, as though they had been handled too many times by too many hands. But Clara knew better than to interrupt. She stood still, her breath steady, waiting for him to speak first. She could feel the tension between them, the silent understanding that had passed between them in the past few days. They both knew that this was bigger than a simple job. It was bigger than her connection to the house. This was about the Cordero family, and it was about something that had been buried for far too long. After what felt like an eternity, the sheriff finally looked up, his face grim, his eyes tired but determined. He motioned for her to come closer. "You came for the truth," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of regret. "I can give you that, but you might wish I hadn't." Clara didn't hesitate. She walked across the room, her steps measured but fast, like she had already made the decision to face whatever came. "Next." "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The sheriff stood and moved toward a cabinet, unlocking it with a heavy key. Inside, the shelves were lined with old, worn books, stacks of papers, and faded photographs. It was a history that had been hidden away, but it was no secret to the sheriff. He had been carrying this knowledge for years, and now it was Clara's turn to carry it too. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound book and placed it on the table in front of her. The cover was cracked, the pages fragile. Clara reached for it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. As she flipped through the pages, the symbols jumped out at her. Strange markings, ancient scripts that felt like they were calling to her, pulling at her subconscious. "These symbols," Clara murmured, her eyes scanning the pages. "What do they mean?" The sheriff's voice was low, almost reverent. "They're part of it, part of the Cordero family's history. They've been practicing dark rituals for generations, tied to the land, to the well, to the very earth beneath us." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Rituals? What kind of rituals? The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the book. "Blood rituals," he said quietly. The Corderos believed that they had to offer something to the land in exchange for its power. The land gave them wealth, gave them control over the town, but it also demanded something in return. And so, the family made their pact. Clara stared at him, her mind racing. A pact with the land, with the earth itself. The sheriff nodded slowly. It wasn't just the land. It was something darker, something ancient. They believed that by giving something, or someone, back to the earth, they could gain more power, more control. They thought they could cheat death, make themselves immortal. But it's never been about immortality. It's about control, about ownership. Clara closed the book, her mind whirling. She had thought she was just here to work, to cook for a week. But now she understood. The Cordero family's history wasn't just a story of wealth and power. It was a story of a twisted, dangerous legacy, one that had been passed down through generations, like a curse that would never let go. "Why didn't you stop them?" Clara asked, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you do something?" The sheriff's eyes darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "I tried, but I was just a boy when it all started. By the time I understood what was happening, it was too late. I'm part of it too, Clara. We all are. The land. It doesn't let go. It takes, and it takes, and it never stops." Clara felt the weight of his words sink deep into her chest. She wasn't just a bystander in all of this. She was tied to it, like the sheriff, like Mr. Cordero, like the children. It wasn't just the house that was cursed. It was the land. And now she was part of it, too. "But we can stop it," Clara said, her voice suddenly steady, her resolve hardening. "We can break the cycle. I won't let it continue." The sheriff's gaze softened, but his expression remained troubled. "You don't understand what you're saying." The land won't let go that easily. It's too powerful, too old. The Corderos thought they could control it, but they were wrong. It controls them. Clara stood up, her hands gripping the edges of the book. Then we need to take control back, she said, her voice sharp, filled with determination. I won't let this continue. Not for them, not for anyone. I'll do whatever it takes. The sheriff looked at her, his face a mask of doubt and resignation. You're deeper than you know, Clara. You don't understand the cost, what it'll take to break it. Clara looked at the sheriff, her mind made up. Then show me how to break it. The sheriff didn't respond at first. Instead, he walked over to the back of the office, pulling out a faded map of the land. He laid it across the desk, pointing to a spot in the middle, a place Clara had never noticed before. The well, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's where it started. That's where it has to end. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the map. She knew what she had to do. The well, the land, the Cordero family. It was all part of the same curse, the same legacy that had tied them all together. But now, she had a plan, and she would follow it, no matter the cost. Her hand moved to the map, and with a steady breath, she traced the path that would take her back to the well, to the heart of the curse. And this time, she would make sure it ended. The house had changed. Clara could feel it in the air, in the way the walls seemed to hum with something ancient. The silence that had once pressed down on her like a weight was now filled with a subtle tension, an expectation that settled around her like a second skin. She had no choice but to wear it. She had no choice but to live in it. Mr. Cordero hadn't said much since their last conversation, but Clara could feel his presence more now than she ever had before. He was always there, just out of reach, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. There were moments when she thought she could see something softer in his gaze, something that wasn't as cold, but it was always fleeting, like the shadow of a memory she couldn't quite catch. The children were different too. They were quieter now, their movements more deliberate, as though they understood something she didn't. It was as if the house had claimed them too, like it had claimed her. They had become hers in ways she hadn't expected. Silent, strange little shadows that mimicked her every move. They were her responsibility now, whether she wanted it or not. Tonight, the air felt heavier than usual, the shadows longer. Clara stood in the center of the living room, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the hem of the dress she hadn't known she would be wearing. The gown was old, yellowed with age, but it fit her perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Made for this moment. There were no mirrors in the house, but she didn't need one. She could feel the transformation in the way the fabric clung to her body, in the way the house seemed to hold its breath around her. Clara didn't know what was happening. She didn't know why, but she had become a part of it. The house, the land, the legacy. It had all pulled her in, wrapped its tendrils around her until she couldn't tell where she ended and it began. And tonight, the final piece was falling into place. There was no ceremony. There was no spoken promise, no exchange of vows. Mr. Cordero was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he watched her. His eyes were dark, but there was something else in them now, something that felt like understanding. Or maybe it was resignation. Clara couldn't tell. "You're ready," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was spinning. Her thoughts tangled in a web she couldn't untangle. She knew what was happening. She knew what she had become, but she wasn't sure she understood it. Not fully. Not yet. The children appeared behind Mr. Cordero, standing in a line, their eyes fixed on her with that same strange intensity. The silence between them all was thick, suffocating. The weight of it pressed against Clara's chest, and she wondered if it had always been this way, if the silence had always been here, just waiting for someone to break it. Waiting for her. "Come," Mr. Cordero said, his voice a command now. It wasn't harsh, but there was no room for hesitation in it. Clara moved toward him, her feet feeling heavy, as though she were walking through a dream she couldn't wake up from. The children followed her, their small footsteps eerily synchronized with her own. The house felt alive now, pulsing with an energy she couldn't explain. It was the kind of place that held secrets deep in its bones, secrets that had been buried for too long, waiting for someone to uncover them. And now, Clara was that someone. She had been chosen, pulled into the folds of a history that wasn't just about survival. This was something deeper, something darker. As she stood before him, Clara felt the gravity of what she had become. She wasn't just cooking meals anymore. She wasn't just surviving in a house that held more than its share of ghosts. She was the bride, the final piece in a puzzle that had been years in the making. The house had claimed her. The land had claimed her. And now she was bound to it in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Mr. Cordero reached out, his hand brushing against hers. His touch was colder than she had expected, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was just inevitable. She had always known she would be here, standing before him, becoming something she couldn't quite define. But now that it was happening, it was as if she could feel the weight of it settle deep in her bones. She was part of it now. She was one of them, one of the Corderos, one of the house's many secrets. The children stood behind her, their presence like a reminder of everything she had to lose. They were hers now, too. She was bound to them, just as she was bound to this house, to this legacy that stretched back further than she could trace. And in that moment, Clara understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about survival. This was about remembering, about taking her place in a history that had already been written, a history of blood, of sacrifice, of things buried too deep to be uncovered. But Clara was the bride now. She was the one who would carry it forward. And as she stood there, her hand in Mr. Cordero's, her heart pounding in her chest, Clara made a choice. She would not be silenced. Not again. The house had its hold on her, but she would not let it control her. Not completely. She would become what it needed, yes, but she would also take back what was hers. The house, the legacy, the children, they would no longer define her. Not entirely. She was the final piece, and she was going to change the game. The house had never felt so heavy, its silence suffocating, its walls closing in around Clara. Every room seemed to be watching her, listening, waiting. The air had changed, too, charged with an electricity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Clara had known deep down that this would happen. The house had always been waiting for her, pulling her closer to the truth, to the weight of the legacy she had been born into. But now it was no longer just about survival. It was about control. And tonight, Clara was taking control. She moved through the house with purpose, her footsteps echoing in the hallway, like the drum beats of a war she had only just realized she was fighting. The children followed her, their eyes blank, their movements synchronized with hers in a way that felt both comforting and unnerving. They were hers now, in every sense. And like them, Clara had become part of something larger, something older. The Cordero family legacy was a chain around her neck, but she had learned how to wield it. The house groaned as she entered the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Mr. Cordero had been absent for days, locked away in one of the rooms on the second floor, lost in his own world. But Clara didn't need him anymore. She didn't need anyone, not to understand what was happening to her, not to understand the power she was beginning to unlock. The fire in the hearth crackled, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The children gathered around her, standing in a silent circle, waiting for something they couldn't name. Clara felt their eyes on her, their presence like a constant reminder of the dark past that had tied them together. But she had no fear. Not anymore. Clara reached out and touched the old portrait hanging on the wall, her fingers grazing the cracked glass. It was a picture of the Cordero family, Mr. Cordero's parents, his siblings. The faces were all familiar, but there was something wrong with them. They were smiling, but their eyes were hollow, like they had known something that no one else did. The secrets of the house, of the land, of the rituals, they were written on their faces. And Clara was finally starting to see it. The portrait was just the beginning. She moved toward the bookshelf, her hands shaking as she pulled down an old leather-bound journal. It was Mr. Cordero's father's journal, filled with pages and pages of notes, rituals, symbols, names. She had seen these symbols before, in the book the sheriff had shown her, the same symbols that had marked the Cordero family's twisted history. Clara opened the journal, her eyes scanning the pages. The words were written in a shaky hand, a sign of desperation. The rituals weren't just about power. They were about something far more sinister. The Corderos had not only been trying to control the land, they had been trying to control death itself. The rituals had a cost, a price that had to be paid. And it wasn't just the family's wealth they had sacrificed. It was something deeper, something human. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she read the lines that seemed to leap off the page. The rituals had been meant to bind the family to the land, to make them immortal, but at the cost of the innocent. The blood of children had been spilled in exchange for power, for control. Clara's hands shook as she read the final passage, a name that chilled her to the core, her own name. Clara Cordero, she whispered, the words foreign on her tongue. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She wasn't just caught in the family's legacy, she was part of it. The bloodline, the curse, it ran through her veins. She had been marked from the moment she set foot in this house. Her heart pounded in her chest as the room around her seemed to warp, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. The house had known. It had always known. And now, Clara was a part of it, tied to it in ways she couldn't escape. She wasn't just here to cook. She wasn't just here to survive. She had been brought here to finish what the Corderos had started, to complete the ritual, to seal the pact. But Clara didn't feel the fear she thought she would. Instead, there was clarity, a power, the power of choice, the power to undo what had been done, to break the cycle that had bound the Corderos to this cursed land for generations. She slammed the journal shut, her breath ragged, and turned toward the children. Their eyes were still blank, their faces emotionless, but Clara could feel something shifting between them. They were waiting for her, just as she had been waiting for this moment. "The house is ours," Clara said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. The children didn't move, but she could see something in their eyes, a spark, a recognition. They had been waiting for this too. They were a part of it, just as much as she was. They were bound by the same blood, the same curse, and now they would help her break it. The house groaned again, the walls rattling as if it were responding to her words. The fire in the hearth burned brighter, casting an eerie glow over the room. Clara stepped toward the door, the children following her, their feet silent against the floorboards. She didn't know how it would end. She didn't know if she would win. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't be silenced. Not by the house, not by Mr. Cordero, not by the past. The power had shifted, and this time, she would take control. The house had always been alive. Now it would finally understand what it meant to be free. And Clara would be the one to make sure of it. The house groaned under its own weight, the timbers shaking, the walls straining against the unseen pressure that had built up over generations. It was as if the house had been holding its breath for far too long, waiting for this moment, waiting for Clara. The children stood in a circle around her, their faces still, eyes wide and unblinking. They were silent, their small bodies a reminder of what had been lost, of what had been buried, but they were also hers now. They had become part of her, part of the legacy she had unwillingly inherited. Clara stood in the center of the room, the air thick with dust and tension. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the years of secrets and rituals that had been hidden in the walls. The power that had always been here, pulsing just beneath the surface, was rising now, as if it had been waiting for her to take control, and she was ready. But there was no certainty in it, no clear victory. The power was there, yes, but it was a force too ancient, too deeply rooted to be erased with a single act. Clara had come to understand that. The house, the land, it was a part of her now, just as much as she was a part of it. She wasn't here to destroy it. She was here to break the cycle, to give it a new form. The children watched her, their presence both a blessing and a curse. She could feel them in her bones, their silent, steady gaze following her every movement. She had promised herself that she would protect them, that she would shield them from the darkness that had once claimed the Cordero family. But she knew now there was no easy way out. They were tied to the land as much as she was, as much as Mr. Cordero had been. They were born of the same blood, the same history. They would never truly be free of it. But perhaps, in time, they could be something different. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the worn surface of the mantle, the familiar heat from the heart radiating against her skin. The fire crackled, the flames dancing in the dim light. It felt as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. She had known this moment would come, the point where she would have to confront the legacy of the Corderos to understand her place in it. And now she understood. The door creaked open behind her, and Clara didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Mr. Cordero. He had been watching, waiting for this moment too, for this final confrontation. She could feel him now, his presence a shadow in the room, just out of reach. He didn't need to speak. His silence had always said more than words ever could. She exhaled slowly, her hand still resting on the mantel. She could hear the soft shuffle of the children's feet behind her, the faint rustle of their clothes as they waited for her to make the first move. The cycle was breaking, but there was no simple resolution, no way to undo what had been done. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The weight of everything that's been built here, the weight of all the lives that have been tied to this house, to this land?" Mr. Cordero didn't answer. He didn't need to. The house itself answered for him. The walls trembled, the air thickened, and Clara could feel it all, the weight of the past, the burden of everything that had been lost and gained. The house had been a prison for so long, and now it was something else, something new. She turned to face him then, her eyes steady. The years of silence between them felt like a chasm, a distance that could never truly be crossed. He wasn't the man she had thought he was. He wasn't even the man he had tried to be. He was part of the house, part of the curse. But Clara was something different now. She had learned to live with the weight of the past, to understand its pull without being consumed by it. She had taken on the legacy that was hers to bear. "I won't let it continue," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "I won't let this house take any more. Not from the children, not from anyone." Mr. Cordero met her gaze, his eyes cold but resigned. He knew, just as she did, that this wasn't just about breaking the cycle. It was about reshaping it, giving it a new form, a new life. He had tried to fight it, tried to control it, but the house had always been more powerful than him, more powerful than anyone. Clara took a step forward, her feet heavy against the floorboards. The house groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo from the very earth beneath it. The air shifted, the weight lifting ever so slightly, as though the house itself were releasing a breath it had been holding for centuries. The children moved around her, their steps silent but sure. They were still part of the legacy, but they weren't the ones who would carry it forward. They were the last of it, the final chapter in a story that had started long before Clara had ever set foot in this house. "I've made my choice," Clara said, her voice steady. "I'm not running from this. I'm not turning away from it. I'm going to rebuild. I'm going to give this place a new purpose." The children watched her, their eyes unblinking, their small hands reaching out to her. They were hers, in a way that nothing else in this house could be. They were the future, the last chance for redemption in a legacy that had been built on sacrifice. Mr. Cordero didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had always been a part of this place, a part of the land, and Clara had learned to accept it, just as she had learned to accept the weight of the decisions she had made. The house shifted again, its groaning less violent now, as if it were finally coming to terms with what was happening. The fire in the hearth burned brighter, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to dance and flicker with life. It wasn't a destruction, it was a rebirth. Clara stood tall, her heart steady, her resolve firm. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She was the bride of this place, yes, but she was also the one who would break its chains. She was the one who would make sure the land was no longer a prison. The children gathered around her, their hands slipping into hers, and together they faced the house, the legacy, and began to rebuild. The earth began to stir beneath them, the land finally ready to be reborn.